Today we are going to talk about removing cabinets, countertops, stoves, and sinks. Actually, most of the details on removing the sinks is covered in a separate video. Here's a kitchen we're going to disinstall today. You can see that there's cabinetry on all four walls. A little bit of the wiring has been exposed already as the demolition begins. The stove and the cabinets are on the right. The sink is around on the left by the windows. This kitchen has a gas stove and a large overhead stainless steel hood unit. One of the first things we'll do is we'll check underneath of this burner top, see what the utilities look like. Here I can see that the electrical's been unplugged and the gas line has already been disconnected. So that's going to save us a little bit of work, and it means we don't have a safety issue. This kitchen also had a double oven, which we've already removed. We took off the front bezel, removed a couple of attachment screws, pulled out the unit, clipped the wires, set it on the floor ready for pickup by our truck. Removing cabinets is fairly simple, and it's one of the most basic jobs you'll do with habitat deconstructions. After checking and removing any trim strips along the tops of the cabinets near the ceiling, check inside and you should find about 4 screws in the backs of the cabinets. Typically a couple near the bottom, as you can see here, and typically a couple in the top. These are located in the top rails if the cabinets have rails on the internal structure, or they'll be directly in the box as we see here. You'll also find that each section of cabinet is screwed side to side along the front edge connecting the section next to it. Let's look here. We see none on this side. That typically means the screws have come in from the opposite side in the adjacent box. However, on this side over here, we do see a couple of screws, one there and one way down here just under the hinge. Now occasionally, if you can't find them at all, you need to look underneath the hinges, because occasionally clever installers will hide the screws under the hinges in the belief it's a cleaner looking installation. You may find it convenient to remove the doors to facilitate working on the cabinets. If the cabinets have this style European hinge, which is very frequent, it's easy to remove them. You grab behind the tab and just click outward. The hinge unsnaps and the door removes. Later, when you have the cabinet removed, you can put the door back on by just reversing the process. Put the hinge into the groove, click it closed. Next, we want to talk about removing countertops and the base cabinets. Here's an example of a small planing desk that'll come out in a total of 6 pieces. The 2 backsplashes, which are actually separate pieces here, although in some cases the backsplashes are molded off the main countertop. 2 pedestal bases and a small frame in the center that holds the center drawer. On the main backsplash, which in this case is removable, we'll do the exact same thing on this side. A couple of blows of the hammer, we'll peel that backsplash off, and we'll have the counter ready to lift out. Now there's a variety of ways that countertops can be mounted to the base cabinets. On a formica countertop, the most common method is to actually screw it up from the bottom in the corners of the cabinet boxes. So to see if we've got screws in there, we're going to start by removing the drawers. At least the top drawer, maybe a couple of others, depending on the space you need. And we're going to look right under the corner at approximately this location, and in the rear corner underneath, to see if we can find a screw that goes up holding the countertop in. If we can find those screws, we'll take our drill gun, we'll remove that screw, the one in the back, and any other screws at the opposite end. And if it's a long countertop, maybe even some additional screws in the various middle sections of cabinets. Now, once the screws have been removed, you'll usually find that you can grab the countertop and merely lift it directly off. Or, if it's a little bit stuck, may have a small amount of glue, a good hard jerk, and it may just pop right off of there. However, in some cases you'll find countertops that were not screwed on from the underneath, and maybe they've been glued on. This is occasionally the case of formica, and it's virtually always the case with tile and granite countertops. We'll talk more about them later. But if you've got a countertop that's glued on, we're going to need to get our pry bar, and working at the corners, we're going to take our hammer and our pry bar and we're going to beat on that until we can pry it loose. We're only going to put the pry bar in at the corners of the box sections, never out in the center where prying would break down the top rail of the cabinet box. And so we'll work a pry bar in at each box section around the countertop, gently pry it off, break the glue, and then pull it up. Now on a tile countertop or a granite countertop, you've got a somewhat different situation. You're never going to find screws from underneath that hold the countertop down, so that method of removing the top won't work. In the case of tile countertops, just plan on destroying it. There's no salvage value. If you make a mess, that's fine. In the case of granite countertops, we're going to talk a little later about how we might salvage some of the larger pieces of granite on that for resale in the outlet stores. Now, I'm not actually going to disinstall this countertop. It happens to be my wife's, and she's not anxious to have her kitchen torn up this afternoon. But let's talk a little bit about how we would take this countertop off so we could get to the base cabinet units. First thing I would do in this case would be to pull off this oak strip along the edge. I'd take my pry bar, I'd just give it a couple of good whacks, and I'd peel that wood right off of there. The reason for that is I want to expose the seam between where the plywood, which is under these tiles, in the top of the box sections are exposed, and once I have that seam exposed, you got it, I'm going to be going in there with my pry bar and I'm going to work around and pry up that countertop. Now on a tile countertop or a granite countertop, the way they're constructed is as follows. Usually a sheet of plywood is laid across the top of all the cabinet boxes and screwed down into the boxes. Next, oftentimes a second layer of plywood is screwed onto the first layer. Now what that means is there's no way for you to get to those lower level screws and unscrew them and disconnect the countertop. So the only way to get the countertop off with the tile or granite on top of it is going to be to pry it. You're going to have to literally pry those screws as gently as you can up and out of the box sections without destroying the boxes. So that means we're going to be putting our pry bars in at the corners where the cabinets have strength, never out in the middle, and we're going to go all the way around. On a large granite countertop where you can't risk flexing the counter very much, you may want to have a half a dozen pry bars and 2 or 3 volunteers and gently lift that by putting in multiple pry bars and easing them in deeper and deeper as you work around the countertop. Here's a granite countertop which we'll remove with the undermount sink and faucet intact. First we'll need to attempt to remove the backsplashes by carefully prying them off, hopefully without breaking them. And then we'll have to pry the countertop unit up off of the boxes as gently as possible. This countertop is glued directly onto the boxes, and only some very gentle work will allow us to remove it without breaking the unit. This large island piece of granite has a fabricated edge. I can tell by looking it's double thick. It was installed over a sheet of plywood which was initially screwed to the cabinet bases. The granite was then placed on the plywood and glued to it. We're going to need to pry the plywood with the granite gently up off the base cabinets and avoid flexing it around the area where the large cutout is for the stove. The preferred way to get a small vanity like this out is in an entire unit without removing the countertop. So we would peel off the backsplashes, disconnect the plumbing, and then attempt to remove the entire vanity with the countertop, sink, and faucet still mounted. Here's an ideal piece of granite for recovery. It's rectangular, it has no odd shapes, no cutouts. We really want to save this piece. We note in the case of this granite there is a tile backsplash which laps over the rear edge of the granite counter. We may need to chip off the bottom of those tiles in order to get to our granite. But once again, we're going to use multiple pry bars and gently go around this unit at the various points from end to end and try and gently pry it up and lift it off. Overall, we find that we can salvage about 60% of the granite countertops by working in these manners. Now, once you remove the countertops, the next thing to do would be to remove the kickboards across the rows of cabinets. If you have more than one box section in a row, in this case we have 2 box sections, one here and one there, you'll have a kick plate that continues across each of the sections. And that's effectively holding those sections together. So we're going to remove that. Take the trusty pry bar, we're going to get in on the end, and we're going to peel that kick plate right off of there so that the two boxes can be separated. The next step after that, same as on the upper cabinets, we're going to look for any connecting screws that connect the faces of the two units. We're going to look in the back of the cabinets and find the screws that connect into the walls, and at that point the cabinet should come out one unit at a time. Well, now we're back to the customer's kitchen. It's been an hour and a half with two people working here. We've removed the cabinets on the right side, all of the counters and cabinets in the center where the cooktop and hood were, the wall cabinets over there, the base unit and upper cabinets and sink on the far left, and we're done. Total time just over an hour and a half.